Thank you, Romy. Hi, everyone. It's not a very packed room, but it's a very good room, so welcome everyone here. My name is Joana Pedro, as Romy just said. I'm leading the social stream, the social thematic area within UNEP FI. And here today we're going to speak about financial health and inclusion. So I have a very nice panel with me. So we have Raje from Mar Agriculture Private, which is sitting just next to me, Tiffany Hodson, who is the head of sustainability and inclusion at the Green Climate Fund. And then we have Dr. Jean, who is the Director General of Economy Analysis in the National Assembly budget here in Korea. So financial health and inclusion is been for a long time an important topic, but it has been even more, its importance has come even more higher after the pandemics and with the present inflation and with more people being, having difficulties and being left out of the economy as we see it. So this need of financial to arrive to people, so the need for inclusion, but also the need on how people can sustain that financial. So how, if I can access a loan, how can I then keep that loan? How can I keep on paying it? And that doesn't become actually a burden and doesn't make that I become even more vulnerable than I was before. So this is a very important topic. How can we ensure that vulnerable communities do have access to finance, but can also then stay within that access? So within UNEP FI, this thematic has come actually from our members. So we work with both banks and insurance. And particularly in the bank side, in the last years, there was really a push for us to work more on financial health and inclusion. So there is a group that committed to work more on financial health and inclusion, who in the last 3 years have been putting together targets on how can we look at financial health and inclusion and how can we put targets within our banks to measure that we are doing it effectively. And that group is, so last year it was published a guidance on these targets that you will be able to find at UNEP FI website, but then also this year the banks are exactly putting those targets and starting to measure it. But it is a complex work. So it's, although we know of its importance, it's still not always straightforward on how we measure, how do we put it in a bank, and how do we put it for a financial institution. That's not always, how do ESG enters in the equation of a financial institution, and particularly financial health. So that's a bit what we are going to try and discuss in this panel. So what is the importance of the social side, and how from the different angles that I'm happy to have here in the panel, how we see this financial health and inclusion and the S within the ESG. So I start exactly on this S in the ESG. And Chin, you did quite a lot of research during the last years on ESG and what is the risks on having and integrating ESG within a financial institution. And so the question was particularly in the S, whether you see that the S is well understood, and how, if it can lead, if having an ESG within an institution can indeed lead to a better financial health and inclusion, and if there's any challenges that you see there.
First of all, I'm so glad to be here today, very valuable event, and I'm going to respond in Korean. So, would you prepare? Because one of the reasons I decided to speak in Korean today, in my understanding, this word, this term, inclusion, is differently translated into Korean. I mean, in the Korean context. So that's why I present my opinion in Korean and try to share my idea with a Korean audience, because Korean audience would look up the recorded, this session later. So 그 제가 생각하기에 이제 한국에 지금 이 포용금융이라고 하는 개념이 도입된 것은 어떻게 보면은 좀 ESG 전체 큰 프레임 중에서는 좀 부차적인 가치로 좀 소개가 되고 있는 것 같습니다. 그렇게 접근한 취지는 뭐냐면 이 주류 금융에서 생각하고 있는 것에 비해서 이 금융 서비스를 받지 못하는 어떤 소외된 계층이 존재하고 이 소외된 계층에게 어떤 사회적 안전망으로서 서비스를 제공하고자 노력하는 것, 이런 시각으로 도입이 소개가 되었기 때문에 어떻게 보면 금융기관 입장에서 보면은 본연의 금융 서비스, 수익을 창출하는 금융 서비스와는 좀 별개의 어떻게 보면 좀 부가적인 것 내지는 어떤 금융기관의 명성을 관리하기 위해서 추가적으로 수행하는 어떤 도네이션에 가까운, 기부 활동에 가까운 이런 개념으로 지금 국내에서는 통용이 되고 있는 것 같습니다. 세션 바로 직전에 지금 이제 이 미스터 호지슨 그다음에 미스터 마호트라 씨하고 잠깐 제 대화를 나눴는데요. 제가 볼 때는 이 두 분이 가지고 소개해 주실 내용은 좀 글로벌 스탠다드에 조금 더 가까운 것 같습니다. 그래서 우리 한국의 금융기관들이 좀 관심을 가지고 좀 많은 고민을 같이 했으면 좋겠다 싶은 생각이 있는데요. 저도 이 두 분의 견해에 공감을 하는데 E와 S는 구별될 수 없는 요소인 것 같습니다. 취지는 뭐냐면 현재 우리가 지금 처해 있는 상황이 하나의 이제 균형 상태라고 보면 각각의 금융기관들이 이윤을 극대화하고 있는 상태라고 보면 우리가 지금 가고자 하는 방향은 새로운 금융으로 옮겨가는 건데 균형으로 옮겨가는 건데요. 근데 문제는 이 전환이 조화롭고 자연스럽게 옮겨갈 수 있을 거냐라고 보면 제가 예상하기에는 상당한 좀 충격이 있을 거다. 그래서 영어로는 ordered transition이라고 하는 부분이 적어도 한국 금융 시스템에서는 좀 쉽지 않을 것 같다. 그러면 우리 금융회사들이 언젠가는 다가올 충격에 대해서 이제 준비를 해야 되는데 그 부분이 바로 이제 저는 S라는 시각에서 좀 접근을 하시고 리스크도 관리를 하셔야 될 테고 그런 부분에서 지금 이 순간에는 E에 대해서 관심들이 많고 E에 대해서 비즈니스 모델들이 계속 제시가 되고 있고 그래서 아마 3층 세션에는 더 많은 한국인 오디언스들이 있을 거예요. 그런데 지금 이 룸에 이렇게 한국인 오디언스가 적다라고 하는 게 바로 한국 금융 산업이 가지고 있는 S에 대한 약간의 좀 오해 그런 측면 때문에 발생하는 것 같습니다. 그런데 ESG에서 E와 관련된 것을 우리가 추구하는 과정에서 S는 동반될 수밖에 없다. 이게 이제 바로 이제 한국에 있어서의 가장 큰 좀 어떤 측면에서 보면 글로벌 스탠다드와 약간 좀 괴리가 발생하고 있는 부분인 것 같습니다. 첫 번째 질문에 답변은 이 정도 하겠습니다.
Thank you so much, Jin. I think that's there'll be actually a session you spoke now for the transition and the need of not focusing only on the E but on the social and how they are connected. And there'll be a session in the afternoon on just transition. And I think it's indeed, I totally agree with you on this idea that the E and the S are inseparable. And I think it's really good to also hear that perspective. So maybe adding to that, Tiffany. So GCF is the Green Climate Fund, so we have green and climate in the name. But you are actually looking into livelihoods and stakeholder engagement, and how to restoring one livelihood quickly after a shock. So could you tell us a bit more on the GCF work, and why are you not just focused on the green and the E, and why social is there?
Thanks, Joanna. So I think I definitely agree with Director Jin about the fact that you can't separate the E and the S, particularly for multilateral development banks or climate change funds and banks. You don't separate the E and the S at all. For us, there's no such thing as a pure climate investment or a pure environmental investment. There's always a sustainability and a social aspect to every single climate investment that we make at the Green Climate Fund and across the globe, at the GEF, at the Adaptation Fund, at the World Bank climate funds. So all of these, the E and the S go together and are inseparable. So the GCF is the world's biggest climate fund. We help developing countries to basically meet the climate crisis by funding both climate change mitigation projects like wind farms, solar energy, but also climate change adaptation projects, so making communities more resilient to the impacts of climate change. And our business model at the Green Climate Fund is that there needs to be a 50-50 balance between the funding for these two streams. So a lot of people, particularly in the private sector, think that climate funding is all about mitigation, but that's not actually true. So we help people in some of the most vulnerable countries in the world, and we drive investments to areas that are neglected by conventional finance routes, conventional private sector finance routes in particular. And the reason for this is because we need to make the most vulnerable countries and the most vulnerable people in those countries financially resilient. So for us, looking at financial health is very much about the ES part of our financing, to make sure that we're not only protecting the environment against climate change, but we're also protecting people against the impacts of climate change. So at the GCF, we have 8 what we call result areas, and 4 of which of these contribute very much to the question that you're asking, Joanna, about the S of ESG. So we basically look at livelihoods, shocks on natural, human, institutional, and physical systems, water and food security, and ecosystems. So to add to this, we also have climate infrastructure, so climate resilient infrastructure. And when you have an infrastructure project that's climate resilient on the ground, it's not only an environmental project, but a social project. So by investing in resilient infrastructure planning, recovery costs after an extreme event such as a typhoon or a flood are very much reduced, and we also avoidance costs are also maximized. Talking about ecosystems, so by investing in ecosystem restoration and conservation, which is a big part of what we do at the Green Climate Fund, the integrity and health of ecosystems is enhanced. So that means that their capacity to cope with extreme events as a result of climate change is also enhanced. And all of the people and communities that live around those ecosystems or depend on them are made more resilient. So in the Asia Pacific region, these important ecosystems are mangroves, coral reefs, river basins, forests. So by protecting and investing in these ecosystems and making them more resilient, we're also making financial health more resilient and communities more resilient to climate impacts. Many local communities and livelihoods depend on these ecosystems, as you can imagine, for water, for food, for agriculture. And without these being protected and restored, the extreme events of climate change are very, very much exacerbated. I want to give a concrete example to illustrate some of how we integrate the social into our projects. So there's a project with financial support from the Green Climate Fund in Norway. It's a World Food Programme project in Zimbabwe. And the reason I'm raising this project is because a lot of projects around the globe are replicable within other contexts. So in the Asia Pacific region, where there is droughts or increasing rain shortages, this kind of project can also be replicable. And basically what we're doing is collaborating with national government institutions on the ground in Zimbabwe to develop a very robust drought anticipatory action mechanism at the national and subnational level. What that means is that just anticipating through modeling when droughts are going to happen and providing finance in advance of that, so that the people on the ground are not already feeling the impacts of drought by the time they get the finance. So the social protection angle is that there's food assistance for assets, and importantly, there's lean season assistance. So lean season assistance basically just means anticipating when a lean season is going to occur, when a drought is going to occur, when people are going to be suffering from food insecurity, and providing anticipatory finance for that. So we also work on early warning systems. This is part of that, but we also work on forecast-based financing. And that means that information that partners receive about forecasted floods, forecasted drought seasons, El Nino, I know that that's a big topic right now in Korea. It allows our partners to anticipate these impacts and predispose the support. So that includes cash transfers. And this can result in increased resilience, less impacts to loss, and people facing extreme events. So these are just a couple of examples of how we try to make communities more resilient through climate change. And again, just to kind of re-emphasize the point of Director Jin, that any climate fund is also a sustainable development fund, essentially, and is looking at health, financial health and health of resilient communities. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Tiffany, and thank you also for the practical example. It's also always good to see how in the ground it works, what we mentioned, so thank you for that. And I will turn now to you, Rajesh, and going more on the financial health and inclusion that we have here. So your organization, could say that has in the DNA actually this financial inclusion, which is part of the DNA. So if you can maybe tell us a bit more about that and about the need of equitable access to finance, and how can financial institutions in general contribute and be better addressing the questions on inclusion.
Thank you, Jana. And thank you, UNFPI, to invite me for this discussion. I'm coming from Myanmar, and I think it'll be quite interesting to put Myanmar as a perspective to provide what are the kind of various challenges what we face in Myanmar and how do we want to overcome these challenges put together. I think Myanmar is already going through challenges, immense challenges for the last 3 to 4 years, the country itself. So it started from the pandemic, then came the political and economic crisis, which is, by the way, still ongoing. And we still had, to make matters worse, a natural disaster, which is the cyclone, which hit 2 weeks back. All put together, it is still a very, very challenging atmosphere to work and perform in Myanmar. I would touch political very briefly because I don't want to take the put into angle of politics here. But political standpoint is quite clear that the unrest which is brought down by this political crisis is not only disrupting the businesses, but also the lives of people. It has impacted all around in Myanmar. The lives are threatened, for example, just to put it. And the ground level communications have been disrupted completely. Excuse me. It's not easy to work in Myanmar, as I said earlier. So it is still a question of life or lives versus livelihood. What do you want to choose? It's a difficult question for a person who has been staying in Myanmar, living in Myanmar, and for the Burmese people also. I'm a foreigner coming from outside. It's a challenge to communicate when the internet is down, the mobile phones are not working. You can't travel into the country because of the threat of life. So it overall brings in a challenge to the business as well. From an economic standpoint, it's still very interesting. The inflation is north of 40% currently. Still ongoing. We don't know where it'll end. There are challenges in terms of putting things together. The imports are challenged. Import poses another challenge. Why I'm bringing this up is it's all impacting financial businesses at the end of the day. We run a microfinance company. It all boils down to how do we get finances to finance others. So according to a World Bank report recently, the GDP in Myanmar contracted by 18%, which means what? Inflation goes up. Sorry. And that brings a huge challenge to the and vulnerability to the business, specifically for the financial businesses. The cost of operations have gone up because of this contraction. It is not easy to work on the same levels as we used to do before. With inflation at 40% plus, contraction of the economy, the challenges for the financial company is immense to look at how do we keep surviving and still providing the same level of services to our borrowers. Last year, there were capital restrictions posed by the government. So money coming in or out of Myanmar, foreign currency, has been a great challenge. Now, every time you have to take an approval, takes about 6 weeks at least, if we get the approval. And the currency exchange is killer already. There's a big gap of artificially controlled exchange rate of US dollar in Myanmar versus the market rate. It's about a 30% gap between the two, which is a killer again. There's a liquidity crisis. There's a banking crisis. And I'm not trying to scare anybody here. It's all real what we're going through. And hence we're trying to figure out what are these challenges? How do we support our customers in these challenges? What support do we need as an organization to function at the level what we really want to focus? It's not easy. Underdeveloped digital ecosystem is another challenge what we face. We can't reach our borrowers, rural borrowers through the country. Unavailability of credit bureau, for example, is another challenge for us to look at. How does the company evaluate the credit worthiness of a borrower? So, I mean, these are few challenges which are resulting in what? Resulting in a big gap between formal lending and informal lending. So the informal lending has gone up. Why? The risk for microfinance companies as ours have gone up dramatically. And these are primarily because of the default rates going up or the indebtedness, over-indebtedness of the borrowers, which means there's a big gap which exists between formal lending and informal lending. The price, just as an example, the cost of informal lending is close to 10 to 12% a month. 120% is the cost of borrowing from an informal channel at a village level, for example. These are some of the challenges which I just put it. What can a financial institution do, and what are we doing currently? I think to start with, I should say MFIs are really dependent on their borrowings. If that fund dries up, it's a big challenge to support the farmers on the field, for example, and which is happening already. The international offshore lending has dried up. The local banks can only do so much in terms of the additional risk which is being posed for the country, and therefore the foreign lenders have stepped back. The local banks are still looking at their profitabilities and support for themselves, which is fair. But can they really support the microfinance company? The answer is very limited. What can we do? DFIs still have to come forward and start supporting the microfinance companies, if at all they can, of course, with the kind of loans, with the kind of credit guarantees, or whatever ways and means they can give, so that the microfinance companies can provide the kind of support what their farmers look up to from them. Microfinance companies still have to keep working. For example, Maha has to still keep working, and still we are working with shrinking bottom lines. Is that a big challenge? It is. I mean, the employees also look forward for a lot of support from the companies, which is missing because of the shrinking bottom lines what we have. I think developing of the digital ecosystem and digital literacy is another great example of what we are missing today, and what we are trying to educate our farmers to use these channels to look at the transferring of funds and use of these things. Non-financial services also play a very, very critical role here. Looking at public health, education, security are the kind of things what we are trying to inculcate with our farmers, so that they can get the right help and support from organizations like us to sustain for a longer term. I think that's the kind of thing what we look at. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajesh. That's quite interesting views from the ground and from a specific context of Myanmar, which in many ways is given the economic world economics at the moment, it will be similar in so many other contexts. You mentioned this importance of education, of health. Could you share a bit also from the experience and from the work you've been doing for the recipients of loans from your organization? Is there any proven improvements in terms of access to education, decrease in poverty levels? And also, other thing is, there is some research showing a correlation between financial inclusion and resilience against climate change, so impacts from climate change. Is that something that you also see within your recipients of loans?
It's an interesting question. Let me just give you some background before I delve into detail. So MAHA is a 100% rural microfinance company in Myanmar. The farmers, what we deal are about 99.9% of our borrowers totally for Myanmar, in Myanmar. So we are a responsible microfinance company, which, we signed up with PRB for UNFI. We also have certified smart campaigns for consumer protection programs, and therefore it becomes quite a huge responsibility as an MFI to deal with the outer world or the external world, to prove it to them what kind of impact, if any, is happening with the kind of loans what microfinance companies provide in Myanmar. For example, MAHA has been publishing the impact assessment report for the last 4 years, which actually brings out a lot of details on the impact where the loans have been provided to the farmers, be it poverty, be it education, etc. The answer to your question is yes, there is a lot of impact what happens. But let me give you some examples. Why would that happen? From a loan provided by a microfinance company to a farmer, why would it really impact? And how can it really impact? I think the answer lies from a MAHA perspective is the tailor-made loans what we provide to our farmers. It's not one size fit all. It is the kind of crop what the farmer grows, and we finance more than 30 crops in Myanmar. Every crop is different. The requirement for every crop from a financing point of view is different. For example, a potato may not require or may require a larger loan versus a paddy because the inputs required could be different. And hence, we have these 30 crops to be measured or maybe more than 30 crops, measured very, very specifically on the loans which are required for each crop. Because we have a larger organization which supports inputs in Myanmar, we have a visibility of the kind of input cost required for each crop. So we specify these crops differently, the loan requirement differently, and hence it actually supports the farmers to look at the right loan requirement for the inputs required, because the cost we know already. And it actually impacts quite a bit on the yield. As an example, last year we saw there was a 5% increase on the yield for farmers who take loan from MAHA versus the non-MAHA customers, which is a big impact for a farmer to look at. Similarly, education. Education has now taken a backseat because of the political crisis in the country. But prior to COVID, we have seen the impact on education, poverty, livelihoods. These are all positive impacts which the loan has provided, has been provided. Dependency has actually gone lower on the informal loans by these farmers. So they look forward for microfinance companies to be providing these sustainable, comfortable loans to them versus 120% kind of informal loan. Microfinance companies provided 28% per annum. So this is quite a significant difference what lives of people get impacted on this whole thing. Climate is a very important part. I think we have not measured climate as yet. It's a very tough one to do. We don't have the ways and means to look at climate measuring. While the group is focusing on developing an app, and we are doing some ag tech, looking into agricultural technology using the satellite, can we really predict the forecast, predict and forecast the climate? The question is still being discussed. While historically we have all the modelings which can prove the kind of, the impact on climate, can we really predict the future is a question what we still don't know. But yes, climate is still a question mark to look at. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for sharing all the work MAHA is doing. I think it's very interesting to have this. this on the table and on the discussion. Tiffany, I would go for you. And in terms of the work that you are doing at GCF, what are the major challenges when you try to focus on vulnerable groups and when you try to focus on financial resilience in face of the shocks from climate change? And particularly when we look at vulnerable groups, we have this intersection of vulnerabilities, because you can be vulnerable because of your gender, economic background, or both together. And so there's this intersectionality. So what do you think also that financial institutions can have a role on this?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think it's really important to look at the intersectionality of vulnerability, and you mentioned some things like gender, economic opportunity or lack thereof, so poverty. Rajesh was speaking about some of these aspects of vulnerability in Myanmar as well and how they intersect. I think it's very interesting. I think that financial institutions, we have a critical role to play and a responsibility, and I think that's even more important, to address some of these vulnerabilities through our financing. Because you can't have a financial investment, for instance, on climate change that does not do that, that can still be effective on the ground. So if you don't build in inclusion of the people that are going to be affected or impacted by the finance, that financing will not be effective. And that's how we look at it at the GCF. So I think what's important for financial institutions, and most MDBs have this, and IFIs have this, including the GCF, is to have a suite of sustainability and inclusion policies, which you could call ESG policies, that ensure that all the projects that are invested in are inclusive in different ways, and look at this intersection of vulnerability. So at the GCF, these policies include our environmental and social policy, our environmental and social safeguards standards, so making sure that our investments do no harm. So they're not going to harm people on the ground, they're not going to harm ecosystems and nature. These are really important standards that need to be applied. And UNEP-FI is also doing great work on those standards. Then you have, we have a GCF agenda policy, and most global investors on climate and environment have that as well, to ensure that there's also gender equality and gender empowerment coming through projects. At GCF, we have an indigenous peoples policy, and this also applies to ethnic minorities, which is very important in many developing countries, including in the Asia-Pacific region. There's also a sort of focus on transparency and stakeholder engagement, and this is through what we call our information disclosure policy and our stakeholder engagement guidelines. So all of these policies come together, and when a financial institution has this policy architecture, it ensures specific requirements. So any partner that wants to work with that financial institution, at GCF, for instance, we work with over 200 accredited entities. These are our partners, both public and private sector investors. They all need to comply with these requirements. So it's not optional. All of our investments do need to be socially inclusive. And of course, they all have the E because we're a climate change fund, so I think that's a given. I want to give an example, particularly in relation to gender, since you mentioned it, and I think this is important because it's where you really do see the intersectionality of vulnerability. So it's an easy example to understand. So climate change impacts men and women differently. This is a fact. There's a lot of research on it. There's always a disproportionate impact of a climate impact on women in developing countries, and particularly in rural areas. I think, Rajesh, you would know this as well. So women's domestic burdens increase with the various manifestations of climate change. They tend to rely on natural resources to fulfill responsibilities, support their families' livelihoods, for instance. And when these when these natural resources are impacted by a climate event, such as a drought or a flood or a typhoon or a cyclone, such as the one that Rajesh was referring to in Myanmar at the moment, it really does impact how women are able to support their families. There are many female-headed households in rural areas in many, many developing countries. So through climate funding and other sustainable development funding, you're able to also target these vulnerable areas that intersect. And how you do this is by, when developing a project for financing, when developing a deal or an investment, you make sure that you have the right people at the table. So you give women a voice at the table when making these decisions about how the project, how the investment should be structured, or you give ethnic minorities a voice, or indigenous peoples, however they're defined within that country. If you're just building up investments and developing projects without the right people at the table, those projects are not going to be effective on the ground. There's not going to be buy-in and ownership when those investments pay out. I can give an example from the Solomon Islands. At GCF, we're funding a hydropower facility with a focus on providing female-headed households with access to electricity through this hydropower plant. So women will have access to capacity development. Importantly, they'll have financial literacy initiatives to give them access to building their capacity on financing. There's going to be a women's consultation program, promotion of female representation in leadership level, in the community level as well, in community level institutions. So this is a climate project, but you can see that as a co-benefit of it, there's also women's empowerment and bringing the community more into the project so that you're not only addressing 50% of the community, but 100% of the community by bringing women in, and addressing female-headed households also has a huge impact on children, on education, on bringing people out of poverty. Just to come back to another part of your question, I want to talk about the need to catalyze and unlock finance to reach more people. Investments that create much larger financial flows to enable bankable projects that otherwise wouldn't get off the ground. This is something that we focus on at the GCF a lot. Like climate resilient infrastructure, for example, this can be very expensive. Climate resilient bridges, climate resilient buildings and roads, harbors, ports. It can be very difficult for developing countries to finance these and raise the capital for them without another investor like an MDB or the Green Climate Fund, for instance. So the GCF, we make investments which benefit some of the most vulnerable countries and communities, and it's directly part of our mandate. Developing countries we serve are the ones that are most severely affected by climate change, and by the way, have contributed the least to climate change as well. So this means that we, as a climate fund, but also all of the other development funds, we need to target our support in a sustainable way. We need to crowd in investment where it's most needed, in a fair and flexible way that responds to the needs on the ground. And you can only do that when you have the real voices at the table developing these investments and projects. Thanks.
Yes, sure.
Sorry, thank you, Tiffany. I think just to add here, 6 years back, there was, as an example, there was a project what we did with UNCDF, where there were 50,000 women who were provided, loans, and just for upliftment and bringing them into financial inclusion as part of the program. Fantastic program. We actually reached about more than 100,000 women to be looked at, and women play a very vital role, at least in Southeast Asia, what I've seen, Myanmar included, where the empowerment of women takes a first step to look at, and women are also quite leading in terms of the business, smaller businesses, MSMEs, what they do. So it's been a great opportunity, at least for us to look at how the women respond to some programs like this. So thank you. It's been great. Back to you.
Thank you. Thank you for that add-on. And I think it's really important to see how indeed these vulnerabilities do play and how things like the gender roles can make a difference on who is recipient of this support. So because we are in Korea and because we are lucky enough to have Jin here from the South Korean National Assembly Budget Office, I would actually turn a bit to South Korea and how, what do you think are the biggest challenges? You did touch a bit already in your first answer, but what do you think are the biggest challenges in terms of financial health and inclusion in South Korea, and what would you say is the role of financial institutions to overcome those challenges?
앞서서 이제 한국에서 그 S라는 것을 바라보는 인식의 차이, 그걸 이제 언급을 드렸었는데요. 조금 더 이제 생각을 해보면 예를 들어서 미얀마나 GCF에서 지원하는 이제 지원 대상 국가들은 전체 기후 위기 중에서 이제 그 물리적 리스크라고 불리는 부분, 재난 리스크라고 불리는 부분이 크기 때문에 사회 구성원들이 거기에 대한 공감대가 좀 형성이 되고 그 방향으로 많은 대응들을 하고 그런 것 같아요. 근데 이제 한국은 약간 좀 독특한 좀 이슈가 있는 것 같아요. 일단 재난 리스크가 다른 동남아 국가들에 비해서 적어요. 그러다 보니까 기후 리스크를 인지하는 일반 대중들의 인식이 크게 높지가 않습니다. 그래서 이제 어떻게 보면은 ESG가 한국에서 빨리 보편화되려면 올해 여름에 좀 많이 더웠으면 좋겠어요. 그리고 전력 요금이 좀 많이 올라갔으면 좋겠어요. 근데 이제 한국에 계신 분들은 다들 아시지만 전력 요금을 올리지를 못하고 있습니다. 그건 이제 사회적인 통합의 문제겠죠. 그래서 저는 다시 한번 강조드리고 싶은 것은 기후 리스크에 대응하는 것은 S 리스크에 대응하는 거하고 동일하다. 동전의 양면이다라고 하는 거고요. 저는 이제 공공기관에 있기 때문에 주로 이제 UNEP FI를 비롯해서 국제기구에서 한국에 요청하는 게 뭐냐면 석탄 발전 멈춰달라, 석탄 발전소 투자하는 걸 멈춰달라라고들 요청을 해요. 그런데 저는 이게 실현되기까지 상당히 오랜 시간이 걸릴 거라고 예상을 하고 있습니다. 취지는 한국의 경제 구조, 산업 구조에 비춰볼 때 석탄 발전을 멈추기 위해서는 이 인클루전 이슈가 좀 해소가 돼야 되는 것 같아요. 즉 너무 빠른 속도로 너무 단선적으로 이익을 추구하게 되면 한국의 경제 상황에서는 S 이슈가 불거질 가능성이 상당 부분 있습니다. 예를 들어서 한국의 주력 산업들, 수출 주도로 성장해온 한국 경제 구조를 볼 때 주력 산업들은 다배출 업종이죠. 그리고 이 다배출 업종들이 현재 EU나 미국에서 도입되고 있는 새로 기후변화와 관련된 대응 조치들 때문에 좀 어려움을 겪기 시작했습니다. 그러면 이제 한국 은행이나 금융기관들은 그걸 생각해 봐야겠죠. 이 업종들이 겪어야 될 위험 부담이 어느 순간에 얼마만큼 커질 것인가. 이 기업들에게 대출을 하고 투자를 한 자금을 언제까지 유지해야 할 건가? 아니면 회수해야 될 건가? 근데 이 업종들에 대해서 대출을 중단을 하고 투자를 회수한 순간 이 업종의 성장성이 많이 훼손이 될 테고 그 업종에 종사하고 있는 근로자들은 어떻게 할 건가? 거기서 근로소득을 얻고 있는 그런 분들은 어떻게 우리가 대응을 할 건가? 이렇게 이제 얘기를 풀어가기 생각 고려를 하기 시작하면 이화에서는 결코 떨어질 수가 없습니다. 그리고 아마 저희가 지금 잠정적으로 판단하기에 한국이 2030년까지 이산화탄소 배출을 40% 2018년 대비 40% 줄이겠다라고 국제사회 공언을 했는데 그걸 달성할 가능성은 상당히 낮은 것 같습니다. 그러면 2030년이 다가올수록 이제 우리는 판단을 해야겠죠. 어떤 연유에선가 국제사회에서 서로가 약속했던 파리 협약을 비롯해서 이러한 규범들이 유야무야 되면서 적당히 2030년을 넘어가던가 아니고 그런 국제 규범이 확고하다면 한국은 국제사회에 약속했던 공언했던 그 목표를 달성할 수 있을까? 달성하지 못한다면 어떤 부작용이 따라올까? 그리고 그게 개별 은행들, 금융기관들, 회사들에게 자산 가치에 어떤 영향을 미칠 것인가? 이런 많은 고려사항들이 있습니다. 그리고 제가 앞서 표현했듯이 우리가 지금 있는 현재 상황은 각 금융기관들이 최선을 다해서 이윤을 극대화하면서 균형을 이루고 있는 상태인데 이 기후 위기가 도래를 하고 여기에 대해서 정책적으로 대응하고 금융기관들이 전략적으로 대응하는 과정에서 짧은 시간 내에 상당히 많은 큰 변화가 있을 수밖에 없을 거다. 그 순간에 금융회사들이 들고 있는 자산 가치가 상당히 훼손될 수도 있다. 그리고 더불어서 상당히 많은 거시경제적 파장이 발생할 수도 있는 것 같습니다. 부문별 실업이 늘어날 수도 있고요. 일부 금융회사는 선제적 대응을 못하기 때문에 자초자산이 커져서 부도가 날 수도 있고요. 그러면 그 금융회사에 연계되어 있는 고객들 그리고 그 관련된 협력 기업들 뭐 적지 않은 충격이 있을 수 있겠죠. 그런데 한국의 상황은 지금까지는 공공부문, 특히 정부 정책 주도로 빠른 성장을 해왔지만 그리고 현재 있어서도 ESG가 불과 2, 3년 사이에 이렇게 확산된 배경에는 공공부문의 어떤 강한 정책 의지가 있었기 때문에 가능했다고 볼 수 있는데 이런 부분이 앞으로는 불확실성이 상당히 커질 수도 있다. 그래서 다시 한번 강조드리고 싶은 것은 금융기관들이 S 이슈는 멀리 떨어져 있는 것, 우리나라하고는 실정과는 조금 차이가 있는 것, 이렇게 생각하시고 준비를 좀 주시면 우리는 좀 상당한 아까 말씀드린 이 자연스럽게 탄소 중립 사회로 이전하는 계획 이게 구현하기 어려울 것 같다. 쉽지 않을 것 같다. 이런 말씀을 좀 드리고 싶고요. 이게 이제 질문에 대한 제가 생각하는 한국이 직면하고 있는 가장 큰 도전 과제입니다. 그리고 쉽지 않을 것 같아요. 제가 5년쯤 전에 이 UNEP 행사에 한번 참여한 적이 있습니다. 그때는 한국 금융회사들 회원사들 거의 없었고요. 불과 한 5년 만에 회원이 많이 늘어난 것 같아요. 이 부분은 UNEP가 참 노력하셨고 거기에 또 한국 금융기관들이 스스로 국제적인 어떤 이 경제 질서의 변화에 부응하고자 노력들을 하셔서 나타난 좋은 성과라고 보는데 본격적인 게임은 향후 한 5년 내지 8년 사이에 나타날 것 같습니다. 거기에서 한국 금융회사들이 다들 잘 그 고비를 넘기시길 바라고 또 다 같이 노력을 했으면 좋겠는데 그러려다 보면 ES 중에서 이 S라는 요소에 대해서 필러에 대해서 우리가 조금 더 진지하게 같이 고민하고 대응 방안을 좀 도출할 필요가 있다. 한국만의 특수한 상황들이 좀 상당히 좀 중요한 요소로 작용할 것 같다. 이렇게 말씀을 드리고 싶습니다.
Thank you so much. I think we are unfortunately over time, so we'll have to continue. I would love to continue this conversation, but I do hope that in 5 years' time, we are here again and we'll be speaking about how in the region on the how social is implemented within the financial institutions and how we can actually follow suit with the region. So I really hope that that would be the way forward. If you want to just very quickly say your 5 words that I know you're prepared to just say on what financial institutions should take home after this panel, and we will leave with that. Thank you so much all for participating in this panel.
Thank you, Joanna. I think I would just take 2. Mindset change is the one which I would say is the kind of most important part to look at. Thank you.
Thanks, John. I don't know if it's 5 words exactly, but I would say that effective investments and sustainable investments are socially inclusive, and I don't think we can separate those.
5년쯤 후에 우리가 다시 이 자리에 모일 수 있으면 그때는 좀 더 많은 성공 사례와 그리고 좀 더 우리가 합의에 이른 비전을 가지고 나눌 수 있어서 좋겠습니다. 네, 감사합니다.